The Lost Tribes from Outer Space by Mark Dem, Part 4, Chapter 10, Birth of the Test Tube Jew. In the course of our examination of the Bible, Yahawah has been revealed to us as a master of space travel, a military expert, and a demiurge capable of regularizing the movements of the earth and reshaping its ecology. But he was also something more, an excellent geneticist and a practicing biologist. He was working on a virgin planet among hordes of hairy hominids who seemed to be more animal than human. Their brains were barely developed to the point of understanding that a hand holding a stone was more effective in hunting than an unarmed hand, and that meat was softer and tastier when it had been held over fire. Yahawah did not have the patience to wait 1,000,000 years to find a congregation capable of appreciating his preaching, and the native earthlings could be only his adopted children. He decided to have his own children by making them himself. The specimen he had before him, he intended to develop intellectual qualities to the detriment of physical abilities. His people would be smaller and farther removed from the animal in their general appearance, with a hairless body like his own. They were to have less muscular strength than those who were the product of natural selection. In their relations with those primitive people, they would depend on their covenant with their Lord, who would support them as he saw fit, according to the requirements of his plan. He would give them a comfortably long lifespan, but he would not make them entirely in his image, because he did not want them to be immortal. He wanted worshippers, not competitors. Nor would they have the key of science, which gives access to knowledge of the world. The Bible does not describe the operation in detail, but it does give the essential points. Yahawah took the necessary chemical substances from the ground, then breathed life into them, as our scientists believe they will be able to do in the near future. It goes without saying that no attribute was the work of the visitor from space had told him. Yahawah had no intention of revealing his recipes. His greatest fear was that the Jews he had placed on earth might become capable of imitating him and setting themselves up as his rivals. And I believe that he does not belong entirely to the past. I believe he still watches our planet attentively and is worried by our tentative progress in the disciplines he has mastered. He seems first to have made a male Jew with the idea of coupling him with an earthly woman. It was for this purpose that he brought to him all existing animals, among which must have been included the hominid I have described. The scene devoted to this zoological inspection is ludicrous. Did Yahawah really think he would find an ideal mate for his creature among the birds of the air and the animals of the fields? We may regard the scene as a condensed presentation, telescoped by tradition, of two ideas: the search for the right female and the designation of animal species by Adam, whose significance I will discuss later. It should be remembered that the two parallel creation stories pose serious problems for the biblical writers who tried to fuse them together without completely succeeding. We must isolate the essential lesson in the mixture in the light of the rest of the work. Be that as it may, even among the hominids, Yahawah did not find the female he was looking for. He then decided to make her himself, to avoid having to go through the whole process again from the beginning. It was probably long and difficult, even for an interstellar traveler. He took living matter from his first specimen and made a woman from it. There are still men who remember their catechism better than their science classes and are convinced that they have only 11 ribs because the 12th was used for engendering woman. This bit of folklore, which has survived despite modern means of disseminating information, shows that the tradition chose its images well. It had only one goal: to transmit true ideas, even if they had to be given false supports. This method was sometimes used in composing the Bible, which can then be deciphered by applying the method in reverse. It clears up all the apparent incoherences. If, with respect to each obscure passage, the reader asks, What idea did Yahawah, the inspirer of the book, want to convey here? He will be surprised to discover a thread of logic running from one end of the Old Testament to the other. Since any man can check the number of his ribs by putting his hand under his shirt, I hope there will be no difficulty in accepting the idea that Yahawah took something else from Adam's body, semen, bone marrow, or some other substance, in order to make his second specimen, Eve, more rapidly. The operation took place under anesthesia, and 3 chapters later, when the narrator sums up, he does not contradict himself when he says, "On the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female." Genesis 5, 1-2. Adam's family did not at first have many daughters. The first 3 children were boys. Where did they find wives? With regard to Cain, the Bible gives us an indication. Then Cain went out from the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod to the east of Eden. Then Cain lay with his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Genesis 4:16-17. The land of Nod is unknown to us. In any case, it was outside of Eden, and the women there could only have been those produced by the normal course of evolution, far from the test tubes of the Lord from space. When he summarizes the biography of the first Jew in Genesis 5, 3-5, the narrator says that he had other sons and daughters, but without giving any names. The genealogies that follow take no account of those later children. One may reasonably wonder if the mention of other sons and daughters is an addition made in order to clear Eve of the suspicion of incest. At any rate, Cain's example was followed, as is shown by this famous passage in the 6th chapter of Genesis. When mankind began to increase and to spread all over the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of the gods saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, so they took for themselves such women as they chose. In those days, when the sons of the gods had intercourse with the daughters of men and got children by them, the Nephilim were on earth. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. To the best of my knowledge, all commentators have identified those sons of the gods as angels. In the context of this book, that would mean that they were Yahawah's companions, occupants of the spacecraft. Theologians would like to overlook that passage that seems to say that the angels of the Catechism had sexual relations with earthly women. To lovers of wondrous gods, the immensely attractive idea, this biblical passage that most strongly appeals to their imagination. But another interpretation is possible. It becomes obvious when the idea of man's double creation has been accepted. The sons of the gods were not angels, but human beings made by Yahawah. The daughters of men were women belonging to older populations composed of people descended from animals that had begun standing erect and growing bigger brains. In other words, the descendants of Adam and Eve remedied the shortage of women by taking wives from pithecanthropous populations, as Cain had done. This form of exogamy was useful in solving a problem, but it could not have pleased Yahawah because it canceled out part of his efforts. His immediate reaction was to put an end to the Adam experiment by destroying his new breed under the waters of the deluge. But before going on to the period after the deluge, I want to make some more observations which show that Yahawah acted as a geneticist. When everything seemed to be going well in the Garden of Eden, and Yahawah still had reason to believe that his plan was succeeding, a traitor appeared, someone who let the cat out of the bag, who knew the flaw in the armor and furtively slipped his dagger into it. Who was the serpent in reality? Here we have the most enigmatic character in the biblical drama. He was an enemy of Yahawah and also one of his associates, which explains his presence in the garden and his knowledge of forbidden secrets. Was he a real serpent? Whatever he was, he could speak. Animals speak little, except in my book, wrote La Fontaine. If animals had been able to speak, it would have been mentioned. The serpent behaved like a human being. His identification as Satan is a much later interpretation developed primarily in the Christian era. The serpent of Genesis was someone who knew, and so he probably came from the same region of the sky as Yahawah. The episode has the appearance of a fable, and perhaps it should be treated as such. In many parts of the Bible, it is obvious that the narrator did not resist the temptation to tell a good story. It generally happens when the account he is presenting contains a gap or a truth not easily accepted. If I attach no great importance to the serpent, it is not because I want to minimize a passage that bothers me. The fact is that it adds nothing to the narrative, except to explain how Adam and Eve, who did not know, conceived a desire to know everything there was to know, how in their youthful innocence they coveted a knowledge that had been forbidden to them by a God so sure of his authority that he left them alone near the tree, with its fruit within reach of their hands. The serpent's punishment was to be deprived of limbs, which shows that he had them before and was not actually a serpent. Our information on him is so slight that we can draw no categorical conclusions. One detail, however, is significant. His descendants were also to be deprived of limbs. We do not know what means Yahawah used to carry out his sentence, but the serpent's infirmity suggests the effect of certain substances that produce birth defects, as in the case of children who were born without arms because their mothers had taken thalidomide. The first punishment for Adam and Eve was to know that they were naked and to suffer from it. Modesty, an essentially social reaction, was an aberrant feeling in a garden where there was no one else but their creator. Is a child ashamed of his body in front of his parents? Even before they had a child, Adam and Eve were embarrassed in front of each other and made loincloths for themselves out of fig leaves. The narrator's subjective reactions may have distorted the tradition without changing its substance to any great extent. Modesty, unknown to the ancient Greeks, was deeply rooted in the Hebrew soul, and it was part of the Mosaic laws. But what kind of nakedness is referred to in Genesis? What was written in the fruit of the forbidden tree? To be naked is to show oneself as one is. To know that one is naked, to be naked in one's own eyes, is to become aware of oneself, of one's identity. What did Adam and Eve learn by eating the fruit? That they were not like others, that they were the product of a special creation with their hairless bodies. They were ashamed before their hairy contemporaries, still cousins of tree-dwelling primates, whose existence they had just discovered. They were ashamed before people of the future because they would always be different. Adam and Eve were ashamed of being Jews. They did not realize that their Creator had made them skip successive stages of development, starting them at a point that the rest of mankind would still take thousands of years to reach. Or rather, they did realize it. He had given them high intellectual capabilities and educated them. Naming the animals meant forming a system of classification, which is the beginning of all science. Passing the animal species in review was Yahawah's first lesson to man, and from the fruit of the tree they had acquired knowledge that made them almost like Yahawah. What did they have to complain about? That very privilege was to be a source of shame for Adam's descendants. They tried to make others forgive them for it, knowing from the start that it would make them the butt of taunts and persecutions, like those that schoolboys inflict on a highly gifted pupil who does not have the physical superiority to make them accept his intelligence. Yahawah had given his creatures a formidable gift. He knew it and warned them about it. Eve would not give birth in the natural way of animals or pithecanthropus woman. She had lost the simplicity of the primitive. She reasoned. She looked toward the future with apprehension. She followed in imagination what was taking place in her womb. Adam no longer had the mentality of a savage who eats whatever he finds in the forest and gives no thought to tomorrow. He was too highly developed for that kind of life. His needs had been broadened, and his stomach required more elaborate foods. He had to till the soil in order to have bread. Yahawah, the geneticist, had patterned his specimen's biological functions on nature as it had been conceived by the Almighty. Reproduction took place by means of sexual relations between the male and the female. The man lay with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought a man into being." Genesis 4:1. Births were regulated, but Yahawah reserved the option of intervening again if a couple had problems despite the capacities he had given them. The Bible often shows him following the development of the race as a doctor follows the progress of a patient. He used his greatest skill in cases of sterility. The story of Abraham is a famous example. When he was 100 years old, he had still not been able to have a child by his wife, Sarah, who was 90. His substitute son, Ishmael, born of Sarah's Egyptian slave girl, had proven to be inadequate at a time when a decisive selection in Adam's lineage was being made. Yahawah had just returned from a long absence during which he had let his servant grow old without having any satisfactory children. He had to act quickly. The situation called for a great physician, since Abraham and Sarah had grown very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Genesis 18:11. But Yahawah was sure of himself. About this time next year, he said to Abraham, "I will be sure to come back to you, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." Genesis 18:10. And when he was reproached about the incredulous laugh, he said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child when I am old?' Is anything impossible for the Lord?" Genesis 18:13-14. And despite her skepticism, the miracle happened. The Lord showed favor to Sarah as he had promised, and made good what he had said about her. She conceived and bore a son to Abraham for his old age, at the time which God had appointed. The son whom Sarah bore to him, Abraham named Isaac. Genesis 21, 1-3. The birth of Isaac poses another question. Who was his father? The text makes no mention of Abraham having sexual relations with his aged wife. The wording is ambiguous. The Lord showed favor to Sarah. Are we to understand that he substituted himself for Abraham, who was too decrepit to father a child? Closer examination rules out that interpretation. Abraham was not the only deficient member of the couple. Sarah was at least equally deficient, and had been so for a long time, since she had been unable to have children even in her youth. How could a birth have taken place under such conditions unless the lacking elements were externally supplied? It is clear that neither the mother nor the official father was capable of producing the necessary reproductive cells. There is only one solution. It was not semen that Yahawah furnished. It was the fertilized ovum. He performed a kind of transplant that our scientists are still reluctant to attempt, and at the same time, he undoubtedly restored the required activity to Sarah's tired old body. I will later discuss the philosophical meaning that can be given to this seeding. A sentence in Exodus makes me inclined to believe that it actually took place. Sarah's child was named Isaac, and his name later became Israel. Yahawah said to Moses, "Then tell Pharaoh that these are the words of the Lord. Israel is my firstborn son." Exodus 4:22. I will also state a hypothesis concerning the frequency with which sterility is reported among a people who were expressly ordered to be fruitful and increase. The daughters of Eve did not give birth without difficulty until later in Egypt. In the time of the patriarchs, laborious conception was the rule. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, was also barren. Her husband was 40 and she was younger, so the situation was not hopeless, provided it did not continue too long. Isaac asked Yahawah for help, and his request was granted. Rebekah conceived twins. The children pressed hard on each other in her womb. Genesis 25:22. The detail is significant. What happened to Rebekah takes place among 20th century women who are treated for sterility with synthetic hormones. How could the Hebrews, presented by some historians as poor, ignorant nomads, have known that this kind of treatment favors multiple births? If the story of Rebekah was invented, it implies that the narrator had knowledge which does not appear in the cultural heritage of the ancient Hebrews or any other ancient people. But is there still anyone who believes that the Bible was invented out of whole cloth? We have no choice but to acknowledge that, as far as we can determine at this time, the story of the birth of Jacob and Esau is based on an observed fact: the genetic intervention of Yahawah, who was concerned with the future of his people. As time went by, Yahawah displayed his control of conception. He decided when women would be fruitful and when they would be sterile. Leah, one of Jacob's two wives, conceived because Yahweh granted her a child. Genesis 19:31. Rachel, his other wife, became jealous of her rival. "Give me sons," she said to Jacob, "or I shall die." And he made this revealing answer: "Can I take the place of God, who has denied you children?" Genesis 31:2. Until this favor was granted to her, there was no choice but to resort to wombs outside the family. Rachel put her slave girl in her husband's bed. A child was born, and she adopted it as her own. Jacob's 12 sons, future leaders of tribes, and their sister Dinah, were the result of competition between his two wives. He fathered 4 of them with slave girls, 7 with Leah, and finally 2 with Rachel. The birth of Samson also followed a visit from an extraterrestrial. "We have seen God," the father declares in Judges 13:22. It is interesting to note the prenatal hygiene that the visitor prescribed to the future mother. "Be careful to drink no wine or strong drink, and to eat no forbidden food. You will conceive and give birth to a son." Judges 13:4-5. It is also interesting to note that the gynecologist knew the sex of the child in advance. He specified a son, and we know that Samson's virility could not be placed in doubt. Yes, Yahawah was a geneticist with great knowledge, but he was not infallible. When he showed dissatisfaction with his work, he had reasons for it. Mistakes, flaws, and oversights appeared, requiring adjustments and alterations. Yahawah constantly reminded his people of the fragility of their constitution. It caused him so much concern that several times he was ready to destroy his work to make another, more viable breeding stock. Had he detected in his creature's blood an element more or less equivalent to the criminal chromosome? It is disturbing to see that violence appeared as early as the second generation. Now God saw that the whole world was corrupt and full of violence. In his sight, the world had become corrupted, for all men had lived corrupt lives on earth. Genesis 6:11-12. The murder of Abel must not have been a unique case, although the Bible does not tell us about those that followed. It merely gives us the names of the few men who walked with Yahawah, his superior creatures, lovingly fashioned to compose his people on earth, were blithely killing each other. The peace of Yahawah was threatened. For the sake of economy, however, he decided against total destruction of the species and selected a specimen less bad than the others. Noah was a righteous man, a man of his time. He was blameless. Yahawah said to him, "That you alone are righteous before me in this generation." Genesis 7:1. Noah was thus an exception, but what Yahawah knew about the laws of heredity must have made him fear that the same process might be repeated when Noah and his family began repopulating the earth after the deluge. Despite his deficiencies, he could not have failed to see that possibility. What was he to do? Run another risk? I cannot believe that. As the Bible presents him to us, Yahawah was capable of making a mistake, but not of repeating it. This time, the visitor who had come to our solar system and performed the remarkable feat of making a new variety of man on the planet Earth intended to take the necessary measures. What were they? His choice was limited. If he was going to keep Noah and his family, he would have to make biological modifications in them to correct the defects he had discerned. On this assumption, everything seems logical. The ark, built in accordance with Yahawah's plans, would enable Noah to survive the cataclysm, but it would also have another function. While the waters of the deluge were submerging the defective breed, Noah and his family would undergo one or more operations to replace the undesirable genes in their reproductive cells, to purify their blood in such a way as to preclude transmission of the bad qualities that had appeared. The ark, usually regarded as the ship of salvation, was also and primarily a hospital ship. The survivors of the deluge would spend about a year in it, which would give Yahawah time to complete his task. When he came out of the ark, the Jew had changed physically. There was no longer any need to observe the precautions formerly required by his fragile health. Before their sin, Adam and Eve had lived on fruit. After they had been driven out of Eden, they lived on wild plants and chiefly grain. You shall gain your bread by the sweat of your brow. After his stay in the hospital ship, Noah was expressly given permission to become omnivorous. Every creature that lives and moves shall be food for you. I give you them all, as once I gave you all green plants. But you must not eat the flesh with the life, which is the blood still in it. Genesis 9:3-4. The Creator was reassured by the improvements he had made. He decided to keep the new variety he had produced, and he made a covenant with its members. Did he make any modifications in the animals aboard the ark with Noah? It is hard to know. In any case, the embarkment of a couple from each species is justified by the need to make them survive. Yahawah made a covenant with them too. He extended his guarantee to the animals that shared the environment with his human breeding stock, whose mission was to repopulate the whole earth. There is one point on which Yahawah followed a fluctuating policy: the lifespan of his creature. Adam was made mortal. For reasons hard to determine, Yahawah put him in a place where the tree of life grew. In other words, he left him with access to a food, a machine, or something else whose use imparted immortality. After the first disobedience, he became worried and took the necessary measures. The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. What if he now reaches out his hand and takes fruit from the tree of life, eats it, and lives forever? Genesis 3:22. Knowledge and immortality were Yahawah's two privileges. By acquiring the first, Adam and Eve had made themselves like him. The serpent had said to them, "You will be like gods." Genesis 3:5. If they had become immortal, the first Jewish couple would no longer have had any reason to envy their creator. The span of years granted to the new breed was rather generous, however. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Enosh 905, Kenan 910, and Methuselah broke the record with 969 years of life. After the couplings between the sons of the gods and the daughters of men, Yahawah reduced the lifetime of his creatures to 120 years. Did he do it in an authoritative way? No surgical operation was performed, and there is no evidence to suggest that some kind of longevity treatment was discontinued to produce the result. It seems much simpler to assume that the Anakim passed on to their descendants a much more perishable constitution, rather close to ours. It is not surprising that some of the artificial man's hereditary traits were recessive. My life-giving spirit shall not remain in man forever. He, for his part, is mortal flesh. He shall live for 120 years. Genesis 6:3. That is, the genetic programming I have instituted will be impaired by this crossbreeding. My creatures are shortening their lives by giving in to the charms of cave women. Are we to see in this episode the source of the prohibitions that hang over sex, and of the ancestral belief that sexual relations affect health? Noah entered the ark with his sons and their wives. Were those women pure descendants of Adam, or did they already bear a little of the blood of the Anakim? Noah's son Shem, the one on whom we have the most information, lived 600 years. Then, in the following generations, the span of life diminished: 438, 433, 464, 239, 239, 230, 148, 205. At the same time, men procreated earlier, usually in their 30s, whereas fatherhood had formerly come after the age of 60. Enoch's father, Jared, who came close to Methuselah's record by living 962 years, waited till he was 162 before engendering his son. No, Yahawah could not have placed people of mixed blood in his ark, but exogamy began later and caused the average lifespan to decrease. Noah lived 950 years. Abraham died at 175. After a very long life. Genesis 25:8. Adam's descendants, who had nearly been immortal, gradually took on a life expectancy that fell within earthly norms. Chapter 11. The survivors of the deluge. The waters of the deluge submerged and swept away everything that was defective. Yahawah acted like a good laboratory worker. He carefully washed out his test tube. Or did he? Genesis says repeatedly that the deluge wiped out everything. It stresses the point in a rather suspicious way. 7:21-23. Every living creature that moves on earth perished: birds, cattle, wild animals, all reptiles, and all mankind. Everything died that had the breath of life in its nostrils. Everything on dry land. God wiped out every living thing that existed on earth: man and beast, reptile and bird. They were all wiped out over the whole earth, and only Noah and his company in the ark survived. The water came from the sky. It is sometimes said to have been a tidal wave, but there is no support for that view anywhere in the Bible. The flood was caused by a long rain. All the springs of the great abyss broke through, the windows of the sky were opened, and rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7:11-12. There are always survivors. None of the horrendous ice ages that man has experienced, or at least not the last one, wiped out all life. After 1,000 years of chaos, darkness, and polar temperatures, human beings came out of shelters in the earth to greet the return of the sun and go back to work. There were also survivors of the deluge. This is implied by Genesis 6:4, which refers to a time just before the cataclysm. In those days, and also afterwards, the Nephilim were on earth. The test tube was not washed out as thoroughly as it should have been. Remnants of earlier mankind still lived in certain parts of the globe. They were composed of people who had been toughened by natural selection and made robust by the climatic difficulties they had been forced to overcome. They were appreciably larger than the Jews. They had developed the structure of their bodies before evolving in the direction of intelligence, and their growth had not been hindered by psychological and moral problems. The Bible gives considerable information on those giants. They were mainly the Anakim, whom the Hebrews encountered when they were about to conquer Canaan. They, the explorers sent out by Moses, went up by the Negeb and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were living. Numbers 13:22. The most striking thing about them was their great size, as the explorers reported when they returned. The country we explored, they said, will swallow up any who go to live in it. All the people we saw there are men of gigantic size. When we set eyes on the Nephilim, the sons of Anak belong to the Nephilim, we felt no bigger than grasshoppers, and that is how we looked to them. Numbers 13:32 to 33. And in Deuteronomy 1:28 we read, our kinsmen have discouraged us by their report of a people bigger and taller than we are, and of great cities with fortifications towering to the sky. And they told us they saw there the descendants of the Anakim, who was the mysterious personage named Anak. He was a giant and one of the patriarchs of the primitive peoples who roamed the continents at the time when Yahawah imported the Jews. The descendants of Anak and those of Adam were two competitive human breeds, one natural and the other artificial, the sons of men and the sons of Yahawah, who were to remain enemies as long as there were men on the earth. But Anak was not the only ancestor. Other survivors of the deluge appear in the Bible. The Emim once lived there, in the land of Moab, a great and numerous people, as tall as the Anakim. Deuteronomy 2:10. The Emim and the Anakim belonged to the people known as Rephaim, who lived in the land of Ammon and were also called the Zamzumim. During the conquest of Palestine, Joshua's soldiers had to confront Og, king of Bashan, the sole survivor of the Rephaim. His sarcophagus of basalt was nearly 14 feet long and 6 feet wide, and it may still be seen in the Ammonite city of Rabbah. Deuteronomy 3:11. All these people were of great size, and so terrifying that the Israelites said, who can withstand the sons of Anak? Deuteronomy 9:2. To overcome them, Yahawah would give the Israelites the help of his spacecraft, used as a weapon of war. Know then this day that it is the Lord your God who goes at your head as a devouring fire. He will subdue them and destroy them at your approach. Deuteronomy 9:3. The maneuver was successful. It was then that Joshua proceeded to wipe out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, all the hill country of Judah, and all the hill country of Israel, destroying both them and their cities. No Anakim were left in the land taken by the Israelites. They survived only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Joshua 11:21 to 22. Formerly the name of Hebron was Kiriath Arba. This Arba was the chief man of the Anakim. Joshua 14:15. According to Genesis, interbreeding between Jews and Rephaim of all sorts produced heroes, or Gibrim. Such was Nimrod, son of Cush and grandson of Ham. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who began to show himself a man of might on earth. And he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, as the saying goes, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis 10:8 to 9. It should be noted that Nimrod was born after the deluge, which shows once again that some of the ancient inhabitants of the earth had survived. The Rephaim were real people. The Hebrews saw them from close up when they attacked the land of the Philistines. We know from the passage in Joshua quoted above that they remained in 3 cities, including Gath. From Gath came the giant whom David killed with his sling. His name has become part of the cultural heritage of Western civilization, Goliath. A champion came out from the Philistine camp, a man named Goliath from Gath. He was over 9 feet in height. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore plate armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs were bronze greaves, and one of his weapons was a dagger of bronze. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and its head, which was of iron, weighed 600 shekels, and his shield bearer marched ahead of him. I Samuel 17:4 to 7. This uncommon warrior came out every morning and evening to insult the soldiers of Israel and challenge one of them to come and fight him. But when the Israelites saw the man, they ran from him in fear. 1 Samuel 17:24. It was a young boy who took up the challenge, too young to be in the army like his 3 brothers. he tended his father's flocks. On the day when he fought Goliath, his father had sent him to bring bread, cheese, and parched grain to his brothers and their commanding officer. Everyone knows how the adolescent David killed Goliath, but that battle scene was not unique. The second book of Samuel tells of other Rephaim. David and his men killed 3 of them besides Goliath. Benab, who was a little less powerful than Goliath, since his spear weighed only 300 shekels. Saph, who died in the battle of Gob, and a phenomenal man whose name is not given. A giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. 2 Samuel 21:20. I have already spoken of Yahawah's mistakes and trial and error procedures. Should the survival of the Anakim be placed under that heading? Undoubtedly so. Yahawah had been too sure of himself, but he faced reality and accepted the lesson that events forced on him. Since the Anakim were still on earth, they could stay there, and there would never be another deluge. The covenant he made with Noah covered all the hairy hominids that had survived. This is the sign of the covenant which I make between myself and all that lives on earth. Genesis 9:17. Now and then, adventurous hunters in some desolate part of the globe discover a monstrous individual, and the discovery is quickly followed by silence. The case of the abominable snowman is not unique. A Russian scientific expedition killed one of them in the Himalayas shortly before World War I. Are there still survivors of the deluge on earth, besides the Jews? Chapter 12. Yahawah is my shepherd. As I have said, YHWH is not God, but he is a God for the Jews. On the whole, they alone have a God of the kind that other people have always dreamed of having. A God who takes a hand in their affairs, gives them rules of conduct, relieves them of the frightful responsibilities that weigh down on man, comes to their defense, keeps account of their good and bad acts, and will probably reward them someday. HWH is reliable. No one can flout his commandments without prompt punishment. The Almighty, the true God who made the universe, is incapable of all that. Even though he is omnipotent, he has arranged things as they are, leaving us to exercise our freedom as we see fit. He has said his last word. As for YHWH, he invented Providence. One of the most curious things about the religions that stem from Judaism is that they have kept the notion of providence, but rejected the only agent capable of fulfilling that function. YHWH, the nostalgia for an attentive God which is felt by so many people, has its deepest roots in the arrival on Earth, several 100,000 years ago, of an astronaut of goodwill. The first concern of the Providence astronaut was to safeguard the integrity of his people in 2 respects, numerical and qualitative, starting with a breeding stock composed of a single couple. YHWH first had to center his policy on population growth. When he had drastically set back his own efforts with the deluge, he had to give the survivors a desire to procreate without delay. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase, and fill the earth." Genesis 9:1. This injunction was repeated periodically to each new branch of the original stock. In Genesis 28:5, Isaac says to Jacob, "God Almighty bless you, make you fruitful, and increase your descendants until they become a host of nations." I do not know what basis there is for the deeply rooted idea that original sin was the sin of the flesh. It is said that YHWH intended to keep Adam and Eve chaste, and that their sin consisted in having sexual relations. It is also said that Eve's apple, which was not an apple, symbolizes the sex act, which was forbidden to man's first parents, or, more precisely, the first parents of the Jews. The Bible says nothing of the sort. YHWH created mankind male and female. That is, He intended them to have sexual relations, but the chosen people also had to keep their qualitative integrity. The genetic heritage consigned to Adam could only be dispersed by crossbreeding, especially since some of the traits included in it were apparently not dominant. The pure-blooded Jew would rapidly disappear if measures were not taken to prevent it. That is the reason for the regulations concerning marriage, which form a golden rule of endogamy. HWH was to some extent a breeder. He was often called a shepherd, and his people a flock. For he is our God. We are his people. We the flock he shepherds. Psalm 95. Shame on the shepherds who let the sheep of my flock scatter and be lost, says the Lord. Jeremiah 23:1. We have seen how sexual relations with the daughters of men were punished. When it was time to choose a wife for Isaac, who was to beget Jacob, the new father of the lineage, Abraham, the head of the family, said to his trusted servant, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the women of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell. You must go to my own country and to my own kindred to find a wife for my son Isaac." Genesis 24:2-4. The mission was so important that YHWH would send one of his subordinates to help the servant carry it out. The servant put his hand under Abraham's thigh, that is, under his testicles, in accordance with the custom of the time, and swore to do as he said. Abraham had been living in Haran, in northern Mesopotamia, when the Lord ordered him to go and settle in Canaan. The servant therefore set off toward Haran. The girl he chose was Rebekah, Isaac's second cousin, as he had met at the well. He gave her a gold ring weighing half a shekel, and 2 bracelets for her wrists weighing 10 shekels, also of gold, and took the necessary steps to bring her back with him. Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. The rivalry between the 2 brothers is well known. The reasons underlying the story are easy to discern. Esau had to lose his birthright because he had married foreign women. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. This was a bitter grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Genesis 26:34-35. Rebekah said to Isaac, "I am weary to death of Hittite women. If Jacob marries a Hittite woman like those who live here, my life will not be worth living." Genesis 27:46. Isaac then ordered Jacob to make a consanguine marriage. "You must not marry one of these women of Canaan. Go at once to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, in Paddan Aram, and there find a wife, one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." Genesis 28:1-2. Jacob obeyed so well that he took 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, his cousins. As for Esau, when he saw that his father disliked the women of Canaan, he married Mahalath, daughter of Abraham's son Ishmael, in addition to his Hittite wives. The peoples whose tents stood near those of the Israelites, or in whose cities they made camp, tried to persuade them to merge with them. "Let us ally ourselves in marriage. You shall give us your daughters, and you shall take ours in exchange." Genesis 34:9. It was the Israelites who refused assimilation, even when foreigners were willing to facilitate it by having themselves circumcised, as is reported in the 34th chapter of Genesis. But Israelites sometimes yielded to the charms of foreign women. When the Israelites were in Shittim, the people began to have intercourse with Moabite women. Numbers 25:1. In this case, the crime was compounded by infidelity to YHWH because the women invited them to the sacrifices offered to their gods, and they ate the sacrificial food and prostrated themselves before the gods of Moab. The Israelites joined in the worship of the Baal of Peor, and the Lord was angry with them. Numbers 25, 2-3. A plague broke out among the Israelites, killing 24,000 people. So that there will be no doubt about the exact origin of the sin, the narrator describes what happened to an Israelite and the foreign woman he had openly brought into his family. Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw him. He stepped out from the crowd and took up a spear, and he went into the inner room after the Israelite and transfixed the two of them, pinning them together. Numbers 25, 7-8. Intermarriage with foreigners meant assimilation, which YHWH was determined to avoid at all cost. It also meant loss of the genetic traits that made the Jews a variety of human beings with specific functional characteristics, a people of priests devoted to worship of the native of a distant planet who had undertaken to be God. In patriarchal times, this fidelity to the chromosomal model was adapted to consanguinity. It later took the path of endogamy. There were thus two successive stages: selective crossbreeding, then non-assimilation, segregation, the ghetto. The practical morality of the chosen people evolved as their numbers increased. The Adam family must have been very liberal with regard to the degree of blood relationship at which sexual relations were permitted. Lack of women, which was the cause of the first resort to outside sexual partners, could not have failed to favor copulation between brothers and sisters, and sons and mothers. Eve herself had to accept all opportunities for motherhood that arose, and she must have given opportunities for fatherhood to her sons. Authorized incest continued into the historical period, as is shown by the story of Lot. It provides an interesting illustration. Even though Lot and his descendants did not belong to the chosen people, having formed a distinct branch at the time of the selection made by Abraham, father of the Jews. After the violent total destruction of the cities of the plain, Lot left the region and settled in the hills. Since his wife had died as a result of the disaster, he had only his two daughters with him. His stay in the hills must have been quite long, and this shows that the means of destruction employed, which destroyed all the plain, with everyone living there and everything growing in the ground, left a remaining risk of contamination that had to be avoided. It must have been long, because his daughters became worried about the continuity of the family, now that they were isolated with an aged father who would someday be unable to procreate. The elder daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man in the country to come to us in the usual way." Genesis 19:31. They employed a ruse. The elder daughter made her father drink so much wine that he did not know if there was a woman in his bed or not, who she was if there was one, or whether he had made love with her or simply slept beside her. The next morning, the elder daughter said to her sister, "Last night I lay with my father." The younger daughter used the same subterfuge the following night. He did not know when she lay down and when she got up, and each daughter had the child she wanted. This story may be regarded as a condensation of what had happened previously in the great Adam family. As that family grew, incest became less close. Abraham married his half-sister. In the next generation, Isaac married a cousin, as did Jacob and Esau. In the time of David, Amnon's sexual relations with his half-sister Tamar were considered infamous. He was madly in love with her. On the advice of a friend, he pretended to be sick so that she would come to his bedroom to bring him cakes. But when she offered them to him, he caught hold of her and said, "Come to bed with me, sister." 2 Samuel 13:11. She resisted and said, "No, brother, do not dishonor me. We do not do such things in Israel." This argument did not prevent Amnon from raping her. David, their father, was angry when he learned what had happened, but he would not hurt Amnon because he was his eldest son and he loved him. It was Tamar's other brother Absalom who punished Amnon. One day when his sheep were being shorn, he gave a great feast and invited Amnon to it. then had him killed by his servants when he had become drunk. The 18th chapter of Leviticus gives a list of sexual prohibitions that limited consanguine relations at a time when the pure and simple survival of the people was no longer in question. You shall not bring shame on your father by intercourse with your mother. She is your mother. You shall not bring shame upon her. The Jew also had to refrain from intercourse with his stepmother, mother-in-law, sister, half-sister, niece, granddaughter, paternal aunt, maternal aunt, daughter-in-law, and sister-in-law, and he was not to have relations with two sisters or two women of the same family, a woman and her daughter, a woman and her granddaughter. The consanguine relations previously permitted had accentuated the physical and intellectual traits of the Jewish people, but to the detriment of their health, according to Leviticus. No one was allowed to present food offerings if he was blind, lame, deformed, too small or too big, or had a film over his eye, or an eruption, and so on. When the Jew no longer had to ask his mother or sister to provide him with the son he needed in order to obey Yahawah's command to be fruitful and increase, he had to follow the rule of choosing a wife from within the community. I have made a clear separation between you and the heathen, that you may belong to me. Leviticus 20:26. When Samson wanted to marry a Philistine woman, his parents said to him, "Is there no woman among your cousins or in all our own people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to find a wife?" Judges 14:3. Unknown to his parents, however, the Lord was at work in this, seeking an opportunity against the Philistines, who at that time were masters of Israel. After the return from captivity in Babylon, a great purge eliminated foreign elements from the community of Israel. Some of the leaders approached me and said, "The people of Israel, including priests and Levites, have not kept themselves apart from the foreign population and from the abominable practices of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. They have taken women of these nations as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy race has become mixed with the foreign population, and the leaders and magistrates have been the chief offenders." When I heard this news, I rent my robe and mantle, and tore my hair and my beard, and I sat dumbfounded. Ezra 9:1-3. The people recognized their sin. A proclamation ordered all the exiles to gather in Jerusalem within 3 days. So all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled in Jerusalem within the 3 days. And on the 20th day of the 9th month, the people all sat in the forecourt of the house of God, trembling with apprehension and shivering in the heavy rain. Ezra 10:9. It took 3 months to examine all the cases. Judges chosen from among the heads of households assigned each person a date on which he was to appear. The cases examined were numerous because the investigation covered the whole people. All those found guilty had to send away their foreign wives and the children they had borne. Endogamy is still firmly advocated by the synagogue, but mixed marriages have reached a percentage that alarms Jewish leaders, says Memi, and he adds that members of a minority group are always tempted to merge into the majority. And for that very reason, the threatened group will never accept such a hemorrhage lightly. But if people whose existence as a group is threatened react so strongly, and especially so persistently, it is because they know that anything is better for them than losing their collective identity. It is a species refusal to die, and millions of individuals have accepted death to maintain that refusal. Here is the whole problem. We are dealing with a minority unlike any other. According to the laws of history, resistance arises and is maintained before an enemy in a series of given circumstances, but does not survive great upheavals. There were no more Romans or Gauls after the great invasions. No one knew any longer what it meant to be a Roman or a Gaul. The Jews resist because of events that happened thousands of years ago. They continue to eat bled meat because of the murder of Abel. Their perseverance is far beyond human capacities. Time, which wipes away everything, has no hold on them. That was our third enigma. It becomes much less obscure if we accept the idea that underlying this persistence is an external intervention, the intervention of someone whose time is not the same as ours and who firmly holds the reins of his people. Or, to use the biblical image, guides his flock with a sure hand toward the goal he has set. Prohibition of mixed marriages has resulted to some extent in consanguinity on a group level. Features have become accentuated and are externally recognizable, even if there is not one type of Jew but several. When the time comes, the shepherd will recognize his sheep, as they are now recognized by the nations, which unwittingly play the part of an instrument of God. Please stay tuned for part 4, coming soon. Peace, blessings, much love and enlightenment to you all. Paix, bénédiction, amour et illumination à vous tous. Shalom.